Hey, so in this video, I want to talk more about the dopamine detox in my experience and why I believe it's sort of broken and it's not as perhaps streamlined as it could be. So, really, the first thing I want to at least talk about is that bad habits don't just vanish. And I'm speaking from my perspective in terms of what I've experienced. I'm not necessarily telling you this, but I found that as much as I try to do detoxes, whether it be dopamine, whether it be from certain habits, they don't just vanish, right? You can't just be like, okay, I'm going to stop doing this today and I'm going to stop doing it, forever for however long, right? They don't just vanish like that. And I've had issues where when I try to sort of get rid of these bad habits, right, where perhaps I was doing it, I don't know, sort of Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, that I then decided, okay, I'm not going to do that said habit again for the next 7 days, right? And that clearly didn't work, right? It doesn't work for you to just, simply just say, okay, I'm just not going to do it, right? Because chances are, right, and especially like, I mean, when I'm referring to things like dopamine and dopamine detox, I'm meaning, well, whatever stimulus you're getting, usually it's something online, whether it's video games, social media, and such. You can't just say to yourself, okay, I'm just not going to do it for 7 or 14 or 21 days straight and assume that it's just going to go completely streamlined. Now, for 7 days, you might be able to do it, right? But anything more than that, just simply out of nowhere, can be pretty difficult to even sort of get a hold of. And so, what I find more so is you need to, in my opinion, adjust slowly. Right, don't try, right, like, I mean, if you're trying to, let's say, reduce your sort of screen time, right? You wanna like, you don't wanna be on social media as much, perhaps, like, you don't wanna be on video games, whatever it might be. You need to adjust slowly, right? Because the thing is what I'm finding, especially, and I've sort of done some level of sort of research into this, is that, if your sort of dopamine is sort of, I don't know, currently at 100 in terms of what it gets, right? The sort of stimulation you tend to get. If you sort of, and let's say that's sort of filled up and your dopamine is more so sort of feel more filled up at the beginning of every day. If you take away, this much, if you take away this much from what you're currently getting, and let's say that is literally to say, right, I'm just gonna quit what like I'm gonna quit social media, I'm gonna whatever and just remove it, then you've taken a lot of the normal stimulation and dopamine hits that you usually get, and that can put you in a very anxious state. And the idea is that if you slowly take things away, you slowly reduce the time you spend on, that certain habit, that certain thing, then yeah, that sort of, I don't know, anxiety, that sort of uncomfortableness stuff, that is going to slowly sort of go down, right? And it's not going to be a point where it's too unbearable. So, for example, for me, right, I've had sort of bad moments with video games, and sometimes I still do, right? It's sort of natural. But for me to, for example, play, I don't know, 5 hours of video games sort of like on a day, or to play video games sort of on a more consistent basis, and then to go and just say, right, I'm not going to play it for 30 days. That's a pretty big jump, right? And especially if the habit that you are dealing with is, perhaps more on the perhaps extreme side in terms of the time you spend, it's like, okay, well, instead of jumping straight to that, right? Sure, maybe this is the end term goal, right? Right, that's great. Maybe instead just focus on, right, well, if perhaps, I don't know, for example, for social media, if you usually spend like 3 hours or 2 to 3 hours on social media, set some form of strict app blocker so that you can only perhaps watch or use 1 hour of it, right? It sounds annoying. It just sort of, like, I mean, like, even me looking at it just feels like, oh, we could probably do it better. But the whole idea here is just doing it almost a bit more painfully slow so that you can start to adjust, and so that you're not immediately taking away everything, but you're not having as much dependency. Like in this case, I use something that's called AppBlock on Android. I think it's on the Play Store. It has a strict mode. Really recommend you get it because you genuinely can't change it as long as you set it in a very good way. And that's really useful because in this case, it's like, okay, well, you could spend an hour on Instagram, but you can't spend any more, right? You're done. And what you can even do is then, perhaps do that for 7, 14 days, and then you could change it to 45 minutes, right? And you just almost make those increments over time to the point where perhaps you're just, like you get to a point where you don't need to spend as much time on it. And it sounds a bit, perhaps bizarre for me to say that now. But I think as you start to take more of a sort of a step away from it, you can get more of an understanding of, why you were even interested in that to begin with. And really, the last thing I would say is, you know, aim to replace habits over time. And that's not necessarily to say to remove habits over time. But for example, if you spend, let's say, 2 to 3 hours a day on sort of, social media or maybe it be video games or whatever, instead of sort of spending all that time, obviously you can put the blocker in there, but you could instead do something as simple as aim to go perhaps for a walk, when perhaps maybe you usually might sort of scroll social media or whatever it is, or pick up something that you perhaps you're interested, maybe get into reading or something. For example, for me, I've sort of gotten more into things like guitar, right, into more sort of reading, and that has been useful as a way of finding satisfactions from things that perhaps aren't as stimulating to what I'm compared to, but I do find enjoyable, right? I do find enjoyable. I mean, especially guitar, that's something that I genuinely sort of find a lot more enjoyable. And yeah, like, sure, it takes a bit of focus and such, but it's still something which I get, a good amount of satisfaction from. And I think overall, really, all I'm trying to share with this is that when it comes to trying to, or at least in my opinion, like when I'm trying to just better sort out my dopamine in terms of, perhaps, well, like in my case, it might be video games. I'm not so bad with social media. I used to be though. Um, Trying to do it slower, trying to do it slower, trying to do it more slowly to the point where you can start, setting smaller boundaries, and then maybe to the point where, let's say, for example, for you, maybe you get to a point where you're only setting 30 minutes a day, then all of a sudden, if you really wanted to, you can probably, get away with maybe doing sort of, like a 7 day without it if you really want to, right? But I find that app and website blockers, and this doesn't have to just be for your phone, I have things on my laptop as well. It's not necessarily to prevent that habit from starting, right? You can try and do that. And like I said before, if you try and go completely cold turkey on something that, you get a lot of stimulation from on a consistent basis, that can be quite difficult and intense. But it's more so to create barriers and roadblocks so that it's either more difficult to access that said thing, whether that be to do it in the first place or for a certain amount of time. Um, or just, like generally that's pretty much it, right? You're not like the blockers are there to try and just slowly introduce you, or at least reduce that time and energy or consistent amount that you spend on it. So really, overall, if you're going to take anything from this, I think if you're trying to sort of detox from some kind of bad habit, right, whether it be video games, social media, or whatever sort of like specific thing, which a lot of the time this is more, I suppose, for online stuff, consider, like having some form of Apple website blocker. Make sure it's like strict, right? If it's on Play Store, I have a thing called App Block. If it's on sort of web or just online, Cold Turkey. A blocker called Cold Turkey. That one's really quite useful as well because you can get a strict mode on that as well. But really, the whole idea is that these blockers aren't foolproof or anything, right? You can still bypass them even on a locked mode. It's more difficult, so, and that's the whole idea. The whole idea is that you can set these smaller boundaries and then perhaps decrease them or increase them, I guess, to some degree over time to a point where there is less dependency on it and you are able to find more satisfaction from everyday things. Hopefully you found this useful, and if you have, do let me know. That said, hope you're well, and I'll chat soon.